I thought what to show, and the Caribbean is very dear to my heart. I am originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I'm a volunteer at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston in different capacities, and had the pleasure of getting to know Layla Bermeo, who's curator of painting at the Art of the Americas collection at the MFA Boston. And a couple of years ago, we kind of worked together, putting together a loan of artworks from the Museo de Arte de Ponce, which is a museum in Puerto Rico. Museum is undergoing structural renovations, so the collection had to be put in storage. So I thought, Layla, there's a great opportunity here because, you know, storage is costly and nobody wants to have works in storage. So they, you know, put them into conversation, and we have a loan from the Museo de Arte de Ponce, which is currently on view for about 2 to 3 years.
We hope longer.
Yes, we hope longer, of masters of Puerto Rican painting from the 18th and 19th century. And some of the subject matter is landscape. So I thought, well, if we do a contemporary show at Russell's Gallery, let's talk about landscape in the Caribbean. And
Yeah, I think even as we were developing that project, so first of all, that project is really significant because even though we are the largest Art of the Americas department in the country, which means when we say American art, we don't just exhibit art from the United States. When we say America, we mean all of Latin America and Canada, including indigenous and island nations. We are extremely proud of that vision. When you walk into, especially the 19th century floor, the second floor of the wing, there for years has not been a single work of Latin American art in the entire 100-year history that floor covers. These works from the Ponce are the first historical paintings from Puerto Rico to ever be shown at the MFA. And that is because of Gama's partnership. I love how he described himself as a volunteer at the MFA. Many of you know that it goes much deeper than that he served as an advisor. He is the chair of our curator circle in Art of the Americas, and also very active with departments of contemporary and works on paper. So like volunteers, putting it very lightly. And the partnership with the Ponce Museum would not have been possible. It was during our Latinx Heritage Night event a couple of years ago when one of the artists, Gamaliel Herrera, who's featured in the show, worked on a program with us that I think also Gama and I started thinking together about how the Caribbean landscape, which, as Gama was saying, is an important theme within the work of Francisco Oye, the 19th century landscape painter currently featured at the MFA. That topic does not just live within the history of the Caribbean. Like, that is something that, even though we see this important moment in the works by Oye from around 1898, when Puerto Rico becomes part of the US, that is not a history that is contained in the past, right? The Puerto Rican landscape existed before that moment. And artists like Miguel Reyes, like all of the other artists you see in this room, continue to really think about Oye specifically, but also just more broadly about the Caribbean landscape in general. And so I think Gama was taking sort of the next step beyond our installation to think about like this issue of landscape in the contemporary work of Caribbean artists who are very aware of both these historical artists and the social and political histories of the Caribbean itself. So I'm so interested, Gama, in the title of your show, and I think that would be a great place to start. So can you remind us, like, what is an archipelago? And like why, we tend to think of the Caribbean as islands, right? Which is like, and often as like, sort of separate from each other, which I bet you have strong feelings about. And so can you talk a little bit about why, like, you're thinking landscape and specifically archipelago, right? As a specific kind of land formation that inspired this show. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so Archipelago is I'm going to sum it up as a constellation of islands or points in space, and they're interrelated, and that interrelationship can take many forms. So in the specific subset of the Caribbean, it is a group of islands, but there are other parts of the Caribbean that are continental. Like, for example, the Yucatan Peninsula, the northern part of South America. And in this show, I have attempted, considering the limitations of space, to just give a glimpse of what these contemporary artists are thinking of, points of view about the subject of landscape in the Caribbean. I am a bit biased towards the Spanish-speaking Caribbean because that's where I'm coming from, so the majority are coming from those countries. There is an underrepresentation of the English Caribbean here, the Dutch Caribbean, but I think that the strategies are very diverse, and as a group they illustrate different viewpoints about what the Caribbean landscape is. About Archipelago, that term in specific I borrowed because there is a Martinican-born philosopher, Edouard Glissant, whose work is now being reconsidered by academics. He lived mostly in France, in Paris, and he was influenced by the post-structuralist philosophers of France, and his work dives extensively into the idea of the Caribbean and the concept of archipelago as a model to understand perhaps what's happening in our world during the globalization, because as he considers the Caribbean to be an early petri dish of all this blending and mixing of cultures, that it's happening now in a faster way due to technology. Like, we're interconnected with so many people around the world, akin to the way the archipelagos, islands were sort of interconnected through trade routes back then. So that's kind of loosely how it's how the title comes for the exhibition.
So you were trying to do like a giant survey of all Caribbean landscape, like fully comprehensive.
No, not at all. But I mean, that's something that is a potential, for the future to continue to explore this sort of line of thought. And there were so many other artists that I thought, oh wow, we could include. But the artists that are included in the exhibition, I have a relationship with as having been a gallerist, and so through the history of sort of like me developing as within the art world. Some of the artists have connections to New England, even though they are from the Caribbean. Like, for example, Gonzalo Fuenmayor, he did his master degree, so his MFA at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. Also, Quintin Rivera Toro, who did The Bench. He graduated from RISD in Providence, Rhode Island, for his master degree as well. So some of them are connected to Boston.
Yeah, which is a great reason to include them here. And I like thinking of Boston also as part of the Caribbean in like a diasporic way, right? Because we have these incredibly deep histories of connections to the Caribbean through the trading of enslaved Africans, but then later through waves of migration, right? And that's how we have these incredibly vibrant communities of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and Haitians. And so it's I think important to highlight where we are also in this show. Like, can you talk about like the work that these artists do, like why these artists? So if we know that we can't do a sweeping survey of Caribbean landscape in this one beautiful but small room, like why these artists in addition to your connections to New England? And was there someone in this room that you kind of started with?
Well, I wanted to bring a group of works that represented multiple media to illustrate that the artists in the Caribbean are working in ceramics, they're working in photography, they're working in painting, they're working in drawing, they're working in sculpture. So that was a consideration, so the media. The other consideration was I didn't want to bring works that were alluding to stereotypical notions of the Caribbean landscape, like banana trees and palm trees, even though we do have some of them. So yeah, I wanted to sort of broaden the notion of what the landscape can be. And for me, an artist that had to be in the show was Miguel Treyes. And Miguel Treyes is he's mostly a painter, but also works in drawing and print work. And these are the two paintings on the back, this one and this one. And that is because these works belong to a series called Chino Latino. And he's investigated a lot on the East Asian presence in the Caribbean. He's of Cuban and Puerto Rican descent, and he tells me his father used to talk to him about the Chinatown in Havana, Cuba. So in Havana, Cuba was one of the first Latin American cities to actually have a Chinatown, because thousands of Chinese immigrants came to Cuba to work mostly in the railroad industry during the late 19th century and early 20th century, and of which there's a very complicated and often, I would say, somber history, because they were migrant workers, but they were really almost like a form of slavery. But in his work, he brings a lot of Chinese art motifs into the Caribbean landscape, and they kind of blend in and become part of it as a tropical construction. And in addition, he includes motifs of the Mesoamerican cultures, like in this particular painting, the Maya figure on the left. So for me, he was an important artist to include because his work talks about the diversity of the Caribbean. We tend to simplify the Caribbean as just African and European influences, but there are native influences, there are Dutch, Danish, French influences, Southeast Asian influences. So I wanted to bring that notion of diversity into the idea of the Caribbean.
Right, and to your point about Archipelago, like the Maya figure in Miguel Treyes' painting there is a nod to the Yucatan, right? To Mexico's like southern tip as part of the Caribbean, which for most of its history, Yucatan was trying to split away from Mexico. Like it felt, so the people there have felt so distinct for such a long time. And it absolutely, part of that has to do with being oriented toward the Caribbean. Also true of the Colombian coast, right? The Barranquilla-based, or Barranquilla native artist when we were there, for the same reason. Even though these are not islands, right? Like they still, the sort of orientation through trade and through coastal life has made them distinctive from the rest of the countries that they're now part of. It helps, I think, sort of think about that arbitrariness of certain geographic borders, like especially in the face of the ocean, right? In the face of the way that the ocean can reshape space for people. I want to go back to bananas though, for a second. Very important. You and I touched on this a little bit yesterday because it's like on the one hand, we like cannot escape the power of some of these images that become associated with the Caribbean or even Latin America more broadly. Like bananas, like palm trees, right? It's like, they really are like part of these places. They are part of of who we become, I think, of the kind of history of images and expectations that we all inherit. And at the same time, we see a lot of artists who think very deeply about how to resist the stereotypes, right? And so you very thoughtfully have both in this show, where you have artists who are engaging, especially with the work on the right, that in which exotic, right, is kind of entwined within the vegetation, within this sort of rich tropical vegetation. But then you have other artists who are really purposefully refusing to create this kind of imagery. Could you talk specifically about these two works?
Yeah, so these two works on my back are by Cuban artist Alexis Novoa, and he is an artist who is based in Havana, Cuba, and also has a studio in Miami. These were created in the Miami studio because his work coming from Havana is kind of difficult to have access to. And these are two cityscapes. So I wanted to include, in addition to natural landscapes, cityscapes. And this is a futuristic, fantastic rendition of Havana. And then this is a more present day depiction of Havana. This is a very touristic tourist place, El Malecón, which is a spot in Havana, which is in front of the Havana Bay. This piece in particular illustrates a technique or a strategy that the artist uses a lot. He uses reclaimed concrete or marble, granite, pieces of architecture that he finds in Havana, which is a city that is literally crumbling. And also in Miami, if there is a renovation of a historical building, he often gets access to some pieces of material. So this is a drawing on a reclaimed piece of travertine marble. This is on the canvas. And so I think I answered the question.
Yeah, and this he also is kind of himself. He works in different sites, right? Because you mentioned he has a studio in Miami. That's where you met. That's where you visited him.
Yes.
But also works in Cuba still.
In Cuba.
And then also in Spain. This is so interesting to me, right? Because it's like the colonial history, sort of recreated within his kind of contemporary life. And I think that's also part of why the work looks the way that it does, right? I don't know how you could be making work like this and not be actively thinking all the time about the kind of irony of being a Caribbean person working in Spain, right? And going back to the sort of colonial center, which by the way is not unusual. It gets more and more typical. When I went to Madrid a few years ago, it was full of Latinos, and I was like, wow, this is really an interesting thing, and maybe even a kind of reclaiming of sorts. The language isn't common, but there are also cultural pieces that are in common too. And so, we're seeing this is Havana, but this is also has everything to do with European futurism, right, of the 20th century. And so a kind of claiming of that also as a Caribbean person, I think is so powerful.
Yeah, and in specific, this piece is called After Bataclan, and it is part of a diptych, but they're separate pieces, but they have been presented together. There were too big sort of to bring together, but the Bataclan incident was a terrorist attack on a discotheque outside of Paris, and a lot of the people that usually went to that disco were Middle Eastern and also Latino people, and so his work kind of reacts to that terrorist attack. So there is that connection to Europe is what I'm trying to explain here. And that's another thing about the Caribbean, that the connections are they're centripetal, so they go out. So they're in the and this is an idea that I did not formulate, but it's actually in Glissant's work, that the Caribbean has two forces that are major, that are centripetal, which is like going out, like connecting to even those colonial European, centers like Madrid and Paris and the United States. And then there is another one that is coming towards and it's like that reclamation of home. So it's going back, and it has to do with also the Caribbean being diasporic, and then it's a diaspora that it's in flux because, like for example, myself, I'm based I've been based in Boston for over 2 years, and now in Miami, but we're always going back. We're always going back. It's not like other migrations where you go to your new home and then you stay there.
Right.
So I think these works reflect that back and forth.
Definitely, and Glissant can also help us think, like when we study, especially art history, it tends to always be focused on how Europe influenced the Caribbean, but Glissant and these artists can also help us think about how Caribbean people, especially now with like the current mobility, are shaping Europe, right? Like are in that sort of going back. They were before, they always were, but like at a sort of level, as you were saying, with technology and travel and access, that is maybe unprecedented. And I have a couple more things I want you to talk about, and I think we should open it up. But one of the things that also you and I just mentioned, sort of like off the cuff yesterday, was about the power of reggaeton, which the way that you're like talking right now about the sort of back and forth, and also just like the Caribbean influencing like the rest of the world, not even just Europe. Perhaps for our current moment, there is no better example than reggaeton, right? So reggaeton, Latin hip hop, and this is something that now is in the hands of like the most powerful music producers in the world, but historically was born within working class neighborhoods in the Caribbean, among people who did not have access to fancy instruments, often did not have education, and were making new music, right, and completely new form of music, based off of what was available to them, right, and based off of the types of influences that were already there within Caribbean life. Is that something you think about too when you think about these artists?
Totally, and reggaeton is also an example of that. It's informed by that back and forth, especially between the United States and the Caribbean. So a lot of the creators were people that had lived in the U.S. and then went back, and it has taken, it's become viral, and everybody recognizes the tunes, and now, as you said, it's in the hands of like big producers, but in its origin were sort of displaced migrant people coming back and not knowing Spanish very well, because they kind of grew up in that flux and they didn't have like proper instruction in Spanish or even like music, but they created this popular voice that was really talking about subject matter that was also not allowed in a way, and a lot of the thematic is political, sexual, and sort of risque, let's put it in that way, and it is a manifestation of that vibrancy and that exuberance that the Caribbean is all about.
Totally, but that's interesting, because I think, like, in some ways there's still, one, absolutely, the way that you get a person who calls himself Daddy Yankee is because he's already engaged, right, with this sort of like back and forth, and it's like a sort of open acknowledgement of like the history of like Yankees like coming into Puerto Rico, right, but then also people going back. Like risque themes have been part of Caribbean, I would say specifically music, which I know less about, but like I know that literature and music are always kind of intertwined, and in terms of protests, right? Like in terms of like protest against dictatorships, in terms of revolutions, always with working class people. And so there is something about the legacy of that I think continues in reggaeton that is really important too, where even people who maybe don't know the complexities of those histories, maybe it's more about their own, for some reason, just because they are from the Caribbean, they are still connecting to the fact that it has in fact always been important to try to shock people with like hypersexuality, for example, in music. Some of you may know the Caribbean comparative literature scholar Doris Summer, who teaches at Harvard. And one of the things she says, but it's very common, I think, like within scholars of Caribbean literature, is that anything you read from the Caribbean always has minimum of 3 different meanings, and at least one of them is pornographic. Like, so like this, this is like that's not something that is completely new, just to say, but in fact is like a kind of, I think, connecting with a sense of rebellion, against the more sort of like respectability concerns, the sort of Catholic or Christian concerns that tend to dominate like governments in the Caribbean, right? But working class people have always, as a form of resistance, I think, tried to have something shocking about their art. Last couple of questions, just because I would love for you to speak briefly. I know that have you met all of these artists personally?
The only one I have not met is Carla Reed.
Okay, that's but I think you mentioned to me that the most senior artist is the ceramicist.
Yes.
Who, this is actually like a perfect segue because she is actually also quite a scholar, right, of Caribbean history.
Yes.
And politics. And so could you just tell us a little bit about how the sort of histories that she thinks about and the political issues that she thinks about show up in her work? And also just what are we looking at here?
Yes, so we're talking about the ceramics that are in the center of the room, and they're done by Chado Oquet. Chado Oquet is the most senior of the artists here. She's based in Miami. She's of Dominican descent. She was born in the Dominican Republic. She has a very interesting history because talking about like going upwards or away and then coming back. So she lived in New Zealand for a long time. She became a New Zealander and won several awards in New Zealand as like a New Zealander artist, and then lived in London, lived in New York, and settled in Miami, and that's where I met her. And this series of works in particular, they talk about the Arrayanos, or the influence that's coming from the culture of the Arrayanos, which are the people that live in between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And this is about 1 million people that are often moving across the border, coming back and forth, and they have they are the literal example of like creolization or like mixing, because they have both the Haitian French influence and the Spanish Dominican influence. Ethnically, they're more on the Haitian African side, and unfortunately, they have been subject of a lot of political controversy and even humanitarian concerns, because often they are considered to be aliens. So they're sort of like in a very difficult situation. So Chara has like really focused a lot of her research and scholarship into deconstructing, all these elements of the different cultural influences that they have, and this series of sculptures or ceramics come from that. They are stackable structures, so they have different components, and they can be recombined. This is sort of like the recombination selection that her night shows at her studio, but the head of one can go into the other, and you know they can. And she often does that, so you can see the same elements with recombination, like a recombination. And that talks about the resiliency and adaptability of the Caribbean and Caribbean people. So it's like you have to make it work.
Yeah,
And there's also a dialogue between the female forms and the masculine forms, because there are some that are like male and then some female, but then some are female, some are male. So she's talking about that also there in a very subtle way.
we actually see that in pre-contact taino art too.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the sort of the like gender fluidity is visible, and I love how like I don't know how concerned she is with like art world and art market, but the fact that you can change them around and make them look different is also such a rejection, I think, of like, this is supposed to be like a precious object that no one can touch, and it's supposed to be in like a white box, and I made it, and it has to look exactly this way. And I think, only someone who's thinking about the issues the way that she is can relinquish that kind of control.
She's a truly remarkable individual and interesting, and I consider her a scholar. I encourage you to look her up online, but she has a lot of YouTube videos that she has created during her residencies in this area between the two countries. She spent a lot of time there talking to a lot of people and researching, and it's truly fascinating.
Amazing. I have one last question for you,
Yes.
Gama, and then if anybody here has any questions, Gama, I would be happy to try to keep the conversation going. What would you like to see next? So in terms of exhibitions, specifically about the Caribbean landscape, like what kind of work do you think? Like where do we go from here?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I think it's that the Caribbean is a model for understanding the globalization that is taking place now. And examples like reggaeton are fascinating. I'm no sociologist, but certainly I think the Caribbean has to be re-examined, and I think that we will learn a lot from that exercise to try to understand what's happening, not only in the Caribbean, but in other parts of the world, including the United States. Yeah. So what would I like to see? I would like to see more. There's a lot of scholarly work that is being done. A lot of universities now have Caribbean studies as part of the cultural studies. But I think this information has to really become sort of like mainstream. Yeah. And art is a great vehicle to communicate, those ideas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gama, and congratulations on this beautiful show.
Thank you, Layla. It's been an honor to, engage in conversation with someone like you about this subject, and the exchange has certainly informed me even deeper into this. So, thank you.
Any